Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of our Macbeth month bonus content. I had a lot of interest from folks about witches and the Macbeth witches and just kind of witches in general, so that's what we're going to be talking about this week. My name is Michelle and I will be your host through this journey of our spooky October bonus content. So let's go. The first question I wanted to ask was, why are there witches in Macbeth? I know that we talked about in the last episode that Scotland is considered a magical, mythical place with all sorts of really vibrant folklore and culture and stories, but also historically periods of intense fear and worry about witchcraft are usually coinciding with periods of political turmoil. So periods of political uncertainty, instability in the government, and anxieties about the power dynamics and power struggles going on in the capital of whatever country is currently experiencing this witchcraft mania or witchcraft fear. William Shakespeare used the devices of the witches because it was a way for him to signal to the audience that Scotland was a vulnerable and unsettled place right now, and what made the witches dangerous was that they sought power. They had ambition and they were willing to do anything to seek this power, much in the same way that Macbeth was willing to seek power and do anything. But the difference is the power that they were willing to risk it all for was magic, and Macbeth's power was political. To understand why the context of the witches gave this message of uncertainty and political imbalance to the audience members, we have to understand where we are in England. And at this point, King James, the first of England and sixth of Scotland, is on the throne, but he is not the first English king to have concerns about witchcraft. We've got to take it back a couple rulers, and Henry VIII, he was actually the first English ruler to enact an anti-witchcraft act. This came out of tensions between the different religious sects that began to boil after he separated from the Catholic Church. It also became a way for him to throw some questions towards his wife Anne Boleyn and a whole bunch of other interpersonal Henry VIII stuff. But I'm going to move on from that. If you want to learn more about Henry VIII, let me know. I'm happy to talk about it. Moving forward from Henry VIII enacting his Witchcraft Act in 1542, then his son, Edward, repealed it. He's like, no, we're not going to persecute people for witchcraft. And then later, Elizabeth I became queen, and she enacted another anti-witchcraft act. Some historians think that she did this because as an independent queen with no husband, as a strong independent woman who doesn't need a man, people began to get concerned about powerful women and power dynamics, and as a way to kind of quash that, historians believe that they may have enacted another anti-witchcraft act to kind of mellow out the people who were concerned about having an independent queen. So people were afraid of powerful women at this point. Some people are still afraid of powerful women. And after Queen Elizabeth's reign, we get King James I / the sixth of Scotland, who we talked about last week. And he was very much interested and concerned about witchcraft early on in his reign. He thought a group of witches were actually plotting his death, and he was very involved in some witch trials, most notably the North Berwick witch trials. And before he became king, he wrote a book called Demonology. This book, Demonology, is about learning how to notice or understand or what to expect from potential witches or people who work with the forces of darkness. And it was also a way for him to begin to find a basis for anti-witchcraft rhetoric in Christian beliefs. So in 1597, all the way up through early on in his reign, King James was kind of the authority on witchcraft and the forces of darkness, for lack of a better phrase. And William Shakespeare gives a nod to demonology. He says, hey, we know that King James is kind of the authority on this stuff when he writes for the witches. The witches in Macbeth actually use some language, some of their ritual is pretty much taken directly out of demonology. as a way of giving a nod to King James and acknowledging that he is the authority on witchcraft and that these are Scottish witches. These are witches that your Scottish king, James, would expect to find. So it was a way of supporting the findings of his king. King James wrote demonology about 7 years before he took the throne, and while he did enact another anti-witchcraft act, as he got later into his reign, he did start to realize that maybe witches weren't real, maybe witchcraft didn't work the way he believed it did, but witchcraft-related crimes continued to be tried and executed well into the 17th century. So this is building up to the tensions of even the American New England Salem witch trials. People often talk about the burning times and witches being burned at the stake. And while that did happen, there are actually quite a few other ways that were considerably more common for people to be either tried as a witch or executed for witchcraft. These include being pressed to death, which is when you lay stones on top of a person until they perish. This is how Giles Corey in The Crucible dies, of the Salem witch trials. People were also often dunked, wherein they would put you in a crane and drop you underwater, and if you drowned, you weren't a witch. But you'd still be dead. So it didn't really make much of a difference whether you were a witch or not. There were many, many ways that people were punished for being witches. Some people were hanged. Some people were exiled. They weren't actually put to death. It all just kind of depends on where you are, the severity of your charges, and the specific religion of the people trying you. It was actually much more common to be burned at the stake for being a heretic than a witch, but often those two things happened to go hand in hand in the eyes of the various churches. Next, I want to talk about the mythology and the creation and the formation of the magic. I want to talk about the Weird Sisters and Hecate and the mythologies that came together to create these characters. So I want to begin with Hecate. I say Hecate because I'm an American. Some people say Hecate, some people say Hecate. She is a Greek goddess, so it's quite likely that you don't pronounce the H at all. And depending on the dialect of Greek that you speak, it could be Ekate, Ekati, Ekat. Once again, I don't speak Greek, so I'm going to continue saying Hecate. She's the Greek goddess of magic, witchcraft, the moon, and necromancy. She is a Greek goddess in Scotland, and so this is where we see that she really is a character rather than a goddess swinging in from wherever she's from Olympus and influencing the world around her. She is one of the witches, just like the Weird Sisters are the witches. The Weird Sisters are a trinity of witches who can create prophecies and spells and just do magic works as they see fit. It's thought that the Weird Sisters are a tie to the Fates, also of Greek myth, but a trinity of witches, a trinity of women who foresee what's about to happen, are something that exists in the mythologies across the world, specifically across Europe. So the Weird Sisters draw inspiration from the Fates of Greek myth. They also draw inspiration from the Norns of Norse mythology, and the trinity of witches could also be thought to represent the idea that every woman exists in a trinity of identities. You are the maiden, you are the wife or mother, and then you are the crone. In fact, the Celtic deity that would more likely fit Scotland, this place, and the ideas that are embodied by the witches would be the Morrigan, and she is a threefold deity. She can appear as all of those things at any time. She can be the mother, she can be the maiden, she can be the crone whenever it sees fit. She is a Celtic deity of witchcraft and womanhood and war and battle and wisdom. So she is multifaceted, and pieces of the witches, pieces of Hecate all pull together and take pieces of her narrative, they take pieces of the Norns narrative, and they take pieces of the Greek Fates narrative, and they create what we know as the Weird Sisters of Macbeth. Witchcraft community is actually very vibrant, and there are a lot of people who identify in this way depending on their culture, depending on where they're from. It might have a different name. You might be a wise woman or a witch, or you could just be like the grandma who knows a little bit too much about herbs and spices. It is a community all over the world of people who believe in the inherent power of nature and magic, and some people believe in gods and goddesses, and some people don't. It's really just a community of people, just like anything else might be a community of people who meet up for a football match on the weekends, or people who go to church on Sunday. Some people practice in groups. Some people are solitary practitioners. Some people are really in touch with nature. Some people are really in touch with technology. Everybody's practice, everybody's path is different. And it's important to acknowledge that witchcraft is not something of the past. It is not something imaginary. It is some people's very active identity. However, there are closed practices. There are people who have old traditions that are intrinsically tied to their identity, to their culture, to who they are, that you should never partake in if you are not a part of that culture. For example, there's a lot of concern about smudging, which is a way of smoke cleansing the house from negative spirits. But it is a very specific ritual done by a very specific group of American indigenous folks. You can smoke cleanse in other cultures, you can smoke cleanse in other ways, but you cannot smudge if you are not a member of that community, and that is a closed practice. Often things like hoodoo and voodoo and that group of practices, why they might not consider themselves magic, those are closed to people of those communities. You cannot have a voodoo doll if you are not a member of that community. You can have a poppet. Many cultures have poppets, which are small dolls that represent a being, but you cannot have a voodoo doll because that is a closed culture. If you're interested in learning more about the specifics of modern witchcraft, let me know. I have a lot of information on it actually now, so I would be happy to do another video or just to answer your questions. This is obviously not a video that tells you everything about the history of witchcraft or everything about modern witchcraft practices or everything about the Hellenistic or Norse pantheons of deities. This is just kind of a fun overview of some of the information. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to look it up. There are some very vibrant polytheistic communities on the internet. There are also some very well-written Wikipedia pages. So this is definitely something that I think would be worth more research if you're interested in it. And as always, if you have any questions or want to learn anything more from me, just leave a comment below, send me an email. I'm always happy to talk to everybody about witchcraft and Shakespeare and whatever fun project we're working on at the time. I'm going to try and do another video for our Macbeth bonus content next week. Let me know if there's anything in particular you would like to learn about. Until then, be safe, be well, and enjoy the rest of your October.